Welcome to StablePod, the podcast that explores the exciting world of decentralized systems and beyond. Join us as we delve into the limitless possibilities of decentralized governance, decentralized finance, and decentralized organizations with the most creative and innovative minds in the space. We'll hear from trailblazers who are building, shaping, and maintaining the future of these decentralized systems. From DAOs to NFTs, DeFi to Web3, we cover it all on StablePod. All right, Gustav, welcome to StablePod. How are you doing today?
Really good. Yeah, our first episode.
Yeah, first episode of a podcast. I know we discuss this a lot internally. You know, we want to have these casual conversations. Before we jump in, why don't we introduce ourselves? Why don't you go ahead and get started?
Yeah, of course. And so I'm Gustav Arentoft. I'm from Denmark. I'm the CEO and co-founder at StableLab. Prior to this, I've been a core contributor to 1inch. I've also been working for Maker. I've spent almost 3.5 years there. I come with a background in economics and software development. And yeah, like, in my involvement in the crypto space, I've been working a lot on the DeFi side of things. I've done a lot of projects with different DAOs, became quite well versed in governance and kind of like meta governance projects. And yeah, today, I run StableLab, where we specialize in all things governance, with a bigger emphasis and focus on right now on the active participation. But the decentralization of these protocols that we all love to use is kind of like one of the key things we want to be working with. We want to, be able to help protocols push forward the decentralization journey. And yeah, like I think this is, also what we want to cover a little bit about in this series of podcasts, right? It's like, we want to, give people like more insights into it. Like governance is a very tricky space, and even though we wanted to have more, we don't have that much transparency always right now. It's something where like a lot of the processes might be a little bit hidden to the general public. I think we want to help other people get the same insights that we have from like working hands on with a lot of these big protocols.
Yeah, I think our positioning honestly is like one of the biggest drivers. Like we see a lot of these things going on, and we just kind of want to put a spotlight to what's going on in the space. So I'll give my quick background. I'm Juan and Gustav. I lead all marketing efforts, comms for StableLab, the governance team, and what we plan to build over there. But prior to that, and kind of the way I got into the space is, I would say primarily Twitter and content. My traditional background was in finance. I didn't want to go into TradFi. So I told myself, hey, let's, this was around DeFi summer. I saw all the cool new things that were actually happening in the crypto space.
Good times.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a good time to jump in. So I told myself, why would I want to go to the old world when this new world was happening? And so I tried everything I could to make it over to DeFi and the related areas in the space. And so what I did was I joined a few, DAOs, a few communities, just contributing where I could, primarily through content. Education was very near and dear to my heart, still is. And so I contributed to like Rabbit Hole, Meta Governance over there. I contributed a little bit to Orca, which was now Metropolis. So everything, I kind of stumbled into governance, and then I kind of stumbled into StableLab, right? So right before StableLab, I was leading content at Boardroom, which is a DAO tooling company, which aggregates, votes and governance votes across communities and protocols. And during my time there, I met some of the wonderful people at StableLab, and I was eager to get back and get closer to the action of governance, and that was like my primary reason I joined the team. And so, obviously we're doing a podcast now, and so content is just, like I said, it's very important to me. It helps educate, especially in this bear market, right? Not a lot of people are paying attention, but we need to keep driving this education initiative, and I think a podcast does that well, right? It helps us spotlight and speak to some of our partners and some of our friends in the space, and just spotlight some of the cool stuff that's happening as it relates to DAOs.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, like right now, like let's be honest about it, right? We know that governance in its current form is more like a niche topic, right? We see the amount of people participating in the forums, we see the amount of people voting, we see that, like, most of the time when people actually digesting governance information, it's typically when it comes out in a clickbait article in CoinDesk, right? Where then all of a sudden, people understand everything about, what happened in that particular situation. But yeah, of course, there's like a lot of nuances, right? And I think, like we've seen some of the things that are working and some of the things that really isn't working. And also, like we want to try to maybe take like a more personal angle, and also try to talk with people about like their experience on like working within governance. There's a lot of opportunities that I think, like the general crypto Twitter, or like the general public is not really like aware about, and like where do you even start? So hopefully we can also like help shine some light onto this, right?
Yeah, totally. I think the biggest misconception is like what it actually takes to do governance. It's funny, you notice this in some of the conferences, right? We just had ETC
Yeah.
pass, and it's like you see like how the public actually understands governance, and they don't really understand it fairly well. And obviously, our position in the space provides us that opportunity to kind of share the wealth of knowledge that we have. And I think people are eager to understand, because it's such a black box. It's such a like hard thing to understand, and like there's a lot of moving parts, and the tooling is helping. The people are helping, with content, and I think that's kind of the main focus with this podcast. But I think more generally, we discussed this previously, Gustav. We want to kind of also talk about decentralized organizations, and also decentralized decision making, right? And so do you want to kind of like double click on what we actually want to do with StablePod? Like, who do we want to
Yeah.
interview, and like what is the focus here?
Yeah, so I think, like one of the things that I've kind of like experienced and seen is that there's this kind of like concept that has existed for you know you would say like a long time, but it's maybe 7, 8 years max. But the concept of a DAO, right? Like a decentralized autonomous organization, which is able to control or take decisions around like a decentralized protocol, right? And like when we use the terminology of a DAO, of course, like this sets like a certain set of expectations, right? Like I think like most people who works in and around DeFi, they have like kind of like this connotation of what a DAO is, you know. And I think like like whenever you brand something with a DAO, this kind of like also highlights what people then would be expecting from this project, right? Like, oh, we are DAO, and then like people say, people have this like idea, like, oh, like if you're a DAO, you should do this, or you should have this, or this is not acceptable, or this you cannot do, right? So like instead of like focusing on this terminology, right? Yeah, like as you mentioned, I think we want to like take like a step back and kind of like work from a different angle, right? I think when we look at the crypto space in general, almost every single token based project would need some kind of decentralized decision making, right? Some level of governance, right? Decentralized governance. Does this mean that they will eventually fit into the box that each individual has inside the head of what a DAO is? Maybe, maybe not. But like the whole point is not necessarily that we need to get everyone to fit into this box of this like terminology, but rather that we kind of like acknowledge and respect that like a lot of the projects will be working with parts of what it might mean to be a full DAO, an actual DAO. Some of them might, want to take inspiration from some of the projects that are more decentralized. They might just pick up a couple of pieces. They'll basically create a framework or like a methodology that allows them to decentralize and take decision based off the parts of their project and protocol which they are looking to decentralize, which they're looking with whatever purpose that decentralization is looking to achieve, right? So in this podcast specifically, I think we want to touch upon kind of like the elements around decentralized decision making. Whether this is like the full on, we want to be fully autonomous, like as little human intervention as possible, everything just works on chain, kind of style, or whether it's something which is we have seen a lot, which is like, hey, we have a big treasury and we want to do grants. This is not a DAO necessarily, like depending on how you define a DAO, but it's still like a place where you can look for like interesting governance mechanisms, and there's still like a lot to work with under the hood of like how these things are actually executed to be able to have this decentralized decision making around a topic such as like, you know, it can be grants, for example.
Yeah, I think it's a good call out. I think it's good to kind of keep it wide also, because as we see this experiment with these decentralized organizations, there's no one way to do it, right? So obviously, you know, what we're very close to is DeFi protocols, but I feel like we'll definitely venture into, you know, some of these other organizations as well. And we'll touch on some of these tooling companies as well. So that'll be interesting to see, you know, who are the builders, what are the teams that are actually trying to help push forward the decentralized decision-making space as well. I think that's also very important to call out.
Yeah, I think, you know, like when we look at like the governance landscape, right, there's like a lot of different stakeholders in this, right? There's of course like the protocols, the projects that is, you know, looking to conduct governance. You know, there's, you know, technology providers, you know, which you meant here, like, you know, different DAO tooling, who's like, you know, we of course we have this connotation that like, you know, governance is not a technical problem, so you cannot solve it just with tech. But of course, enabling people to do certain things is like an important step along the path, right? So definitely some tooling is always needed or required. It can of course be done without, you know, we saw, you know, for example, MegaDAO, you know, being able to execute their governance long before we had any of this like DAO tooling being ready made, right? But then you just have to build it custom, and that's of course a big investment that kind of like requires you to really wanting this for it to be beneficial, right? So, you know, with addition to something like Snapshot that basically enabled, you know, everyone to set up, you know, token based voting. It's not, you know, on chain, it's not enforceable in any of your contracts, things like this, but it's still, you know, like allowing people to take decisions. The decision requires social consensus to be executed afterwards, but basically, you know, we kind of like have tooling that of course like makes it easier to start doing governance. So that's like another stakeholder, right? And then there's, you know, like the service providers, which is another kind of like vertical within the DAO space, right? Which is, you know, what you can say that we also are, right? We like the services we provide are like around, you know, like framework optimization and you know, active governance participation as you know, like leading delegates in kind of like the professional delegate space. And then also, you know, like taking roles in various committees. And then I think like the last of like the verticals where we also will be talking with, they almost fall under the same as the protocols, the projects, right? But those are the contributors. So, you know, we are looking at, you know, like it can both be core contributors, it can be foundation team members, it can be community members that are joined as a contributor, it can be, you know, the decentralized workforce that are getting hired by the DAO. But I think like those are like the main kind of group of people that we're like interested in kind of like getting on board, right? And again, like kind of like sharing also like, you know, their personal take and experiences on these things, you know.
Yeah, definitely. The way you described um, the mapping of all the stakeholders, I think it's maybe a lot of people understand how, like, we see it, but it's still kind of hard to understand or even reach that. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, and what I mean by that is there's a lot of people working on Lido, but not everyone completely understands. Okay, like, who do I go to kind of, you know, help facilitate, you know, X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
And so this comes back to the point of like, okay, so who should we talk to that knows about this, right? And this is something with time that is clearing up, I think, right? We're hoping with better tooling. It like Aave is a perfect example, right? We were just at ECC, and Mark Zeller gave a presentation, and there was a diagram he showcased in his presentation, and it showed like the various entities that are helping service Aave, and I think that simple diagram helps a lot. And I was just in another like Telegram group, and people were like, okay, who's actually helping contribute to Aave? Like, oh, Gauntlet, Chaos Labs, Mark Zeller, like who else? So I think like helping uncover like the map of the contributors at a DAO by speaking to them and telling and having them tell us about their experience, I think is also really great. And this medium of podcasting and helps with that, right? And I noticed that like just from personal experience, other podcasts in the space, they'll have a person and like, oh, that's the guy that's helping do this. Like, and I think that's so important because it humanizes and it helps you connect the dots, and then it helps you also learn from someone actually on the ground. And so I think a podcast, hopefully, it really helps with helping us learn from each other in the space. And as the space progresses, we're starting to see more and more of these, podcasts. And I think that's what we hope to accomplish here.
Yeah, and I think this is also like some of the things that we would like to see more of, right? And also why we kind of got you, Juan, on the team, right? Is that we want to see better education around governance, right? I think I was quite lucky of the first crypto project I joined full time was MakerDAO, right? So I kind of got thrown into you're gonna work for the foundation. I heard all of these crazy stories from the past, when Maker was a DAO, like in the very early days. Maker started as a DAO first, right, and then converted itself into a foundation because launching as a DAO first back then was crazy. And then we went through the foundation, and then kind of went through the process again of converting back to a DAO without a foundation, without a central entity on board, right? So just by going through that, we kind of experienced, what it actually meant of being decentralizing, right? Of going through this process. And that was also, what inspired, me and my co-founder, Du, who's also a former Maker guy, to, really start working more on governance, right? It also happened to be the case that every single project we talked with after this, they said, we need help with governance. So it was clearly like a lag in the market. But basically, we kind of experienced this, right? And this is something something that Maker went through as the first team, and something I think we hopefully will see a lot more team attempt in the future, right? So yeah, I think there, kind of being inside the organization that was kind of leading the way from a visionary level at that point, and going through that process, I think was also something that really inspired me a lot, right? But now we basically have since the bear market kind of came over us, we see a much bigger emphasis on governance, right? All of a sudden there's more pressure from various jurisdictions around the world, which kind of pushes people towards wanting to become more decentralized. We've also seen some of the DAOs that in the bull market had bigger budgets, all of a sudden seeing their treasuries drop a lot, especially the native token, the less diversified treasuries drop a lot, their revenues shrinking, their customer base evaporating, right, dropping 90-95%. And then what happens, right, is that once you need to start taking more difficult decisions, this creates conflict, right? In general, if you have to fire people or cut budgets, remove parts, this is creating conflict inside the DAO. And actually, governance evolves a lot with conflict, right? So, some people that have this perception that if you don't have conflict, this is actually good governance, right? Because then everyone just agrees, it's great, blah blah blah. But you're actually only realizing how your governance is able to deal with problems once you have conflict. So actually,
that's such a Maker thing to say. Sorry, I just wanted to jump in and say that. Sorry, good, continue.
Yeah. But we see it also outside of Maker. I mean, Maker is of course notorious for drama, but in the protocols we've been working in, we've seen a lot of different types of conflict, right? You kind of often have this kind of trilemma in a lot of the especially also the younger DAOs, right? You have the foundation or the core team, what they want. Then you have the delegates and the governance community, what they want, and then you have the general community, the end user, what they want and need and expect from the product, right? So here you kind of need to balance this triangle here, and it often happens that there's clashes inside of it, right? Maybe the foundation wants to do something that the DAO contributors doesn't want to do, and so on. And this is kind of where you can test the robustness of your governance systems, right? And where your processes are being tested. And this has happened a lot in the bear market, I think, and this has also enabled more and more focus on governance. So we've really seen such a big interest explosion in governance here in the bear market.
Yeah, that's interesting the way you describe that. Would you say it's fair to say that it's a new wave of of projects maturing to a point where they're okay, now I guess the timing was kind of like not so great, right? Because now it's bear, but it's like, oh, but now we had to actually do stuff in governance. Like, do you see it as like this new wave? You mentioned like the early days of Maker and Aave as like maybe like the first wave, and then it's like everything got to a point where
Yeah.
it's like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Do you have any thoughts about that? About the new wave of governance?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's more like in a bull market, everyone is focused on one thing, right? And that is like acquiring as much market share as possible because there's a huge amount of interest, and like the money you can earn there for like a protocol can really like make or break it, right? So like in a bull market, you're really just trying to like get as much explosive growth as possible, and that's like your only focus. Um, Bear market for builders, so people say, right? So I think just like once all the noise is gone, that's when people can start focusing a bit again, right? So like for us at least, we've also seen like a massive interest increase in like the bear market, right? And like we see like a lot of the protocols, they're running into a lot of the same problems, right? And this is also some of the stuff we really want to be talking about here is how do you actually tackle kind of like the problems that like are rising from like a protocol which has gone through this like growth in the bull market, and then all of a sudden now in the bear market is starting to pay more attention to their governance, right? Basically, this is kind of like the protocols that we reference as being, like mature product and immature DAO, immature governance, right? You have a product that found product market fit, did very well in the bull market, typically. In the bear market, it still has users, still being used. It's kind of like found its place as like, like a DeFi protocol, for example, that now acts as one of the pillars within the DeFi ecosystem, right? Now what they want to do next is that they want to build a DAO that is able to support kind of like the protocol as they have built it up, right? And like, how do you actually tackle this? How do you ensure that like you're able to take on the right responsibilities, pass it over to the community in like a sustainable way over time, get the right contributors coming in, and so on, right? This is stuff we work quite a lot with. We've worked with quite a few protocols that kind of like fit this positioning here, right? So yeah, like the next steps there is basically like how do you actually facilitate this in a good way, right? Because this is where it can become like a bit frustrating, right? Because you've done really well on the product side, and then now you need to tackle kind of like the other problems that you pushed aside for a bit, which is around DAOs and governance.
Yeah, totally. I think what we see a lot of, and you touched on this with what you just said, is that we see a lot of interest in governance. We see a lot of people doing the same things over and over again, some of the same mistakes. And so what we at StableLab, we try to facilitate, we try to advise, we try to get involved, right? Get involved in a lot of these different communities. And it's funny because I speak, when people speak to us, I have people DM me and say like, oh, I see you guys everywhere. And it's like, we take that with a badge of honor, right? We take that as like, we try to be as involved as much as possible where we are, to kind of expose ourselves and to learn, right? To learn from everything that's happening around the space, and then take that and teach others and apply them to the communities where we're involved in. So I feel like it's a great opportunity to kind of, where we stand, to kind of continue to share what we've learned, and hopefully people will take that and build upon. And you've seen that, like, there's a lot of these new interesting projects too, as it relates to governance, that are smaller. Like, I just want to call out Butter. Butter is also an interesting experiment, that you just see in the bear market, right? People just they were doing something else before, and then they're like, okay, now I want to do something useful, and I want to do something interesting in the space. And it's like, what's hard? We have decentralizing sequencers. We have all the infrastructure, right? I'll leave that to Hasu and them. But what we're here today to talk about is like, governance, and like, how do you decentralize a grants program and all that stuff, right? So I think that's where we're kind of more of, I wouldn't say experts, but more knowledgeable in talking about.
Yeah, I think it's also like important to highlight here that I don't think that we've found like the optimal model yet, right? I think that it's not like anyone has really cracked the code. I think like the closest thing we get to something which is kind of like working quite well from like what I would like say is like a decentralized autonomous, which autonomy is important here, organization, is something like Curve, right? Where you basically just have like the governance of Curve is just like people putting their money in and like basically redirecting the emissions. And here you have like a model which is like purely driven by like the financial primitives of the protocol itself, of the emission structure itself. And of course, there's the whole these like bribing layers built on top and everything. But there you have something which I think is like pretty close to like an autonomous organization, right? But like this just does not work for all protocols, right? You actually have to take decisions in protocols like Maker and Aave and so on, right? So like, how do you actually, do this correctly? And I think, with Maker now, kind of like saying, okay, what we did before, which was basically like saying like, hey, the DAO can do everything, and it tried to do everything. That didn't work, right? Like, it became operationally unfeasible for them to actually manage even like day-to-day tasks because everyone was paying so much attention to the, way too many things that were happening inside the DAO, right? So, okay, that was also not the road we should go, right? So now they're trying to do this new thing with like the end game plan, super interesting structure. We'll probably see if we can get one of the, Maker people on to also talk more about this, as it plays out. And I think there's some really interesting protocols, like Spark protocol run by Sam and Nadia.
Can we just call out Anya as well? Because I think, right, I wanted to address, the important. I wanted to address the idea that some people have, which is that governance is not important or relevant, right? We have some of these protocols. You kind of touched on it, right, with Curve and certain governance models, ungovernance, right, like Reflexer and Anya, like this. So we say governance, but we're also talking about decision making. Like there's still decision making processes happening inside of these protocols. I believe Anya is gonna. I actually think it's pronounced Ajna. Ajna. So there's still some form of that, right? And there's still something there worth teaching others about. So I think that's what we want to do. At the end of the day, that's what we want to do.
There's this funny thing, which is like a lot of the former Maker people, they want to do these like, ungovernance, like minimal governance protocols now.
They're traumatized.
People can like, they got so traumatized. So like most of the, like the Maker alumni founded like a lot of projects, right? And have really, really done well because like when the foundation disbanded, it was kind of like, either you can go work for the DAO or you can, go out and seek your own, adventures. And a lot of people were like, okay, like let's go out and seek our own adventures. And like me and Do was also some of them, right? But a lot of the protocols came out of this are like minimum governance, like we don't want too much of this. But yeah, like it's true, like you have like both actually Spark as well. I believe Spark's governance is mainly tied to Maker, right? So it kind of like just follows the governance of Maker. So they're also saying like, hey, on like our protocol level, we want to have like as little governance as possible. Ashna, borrowing and lending market, fully automatic, no governance in the pools, no governance for collateral, asset listing, anything like this. So kind of like saying, okay, like, something like you're building a market like Aave, but you don't need to manage the risk. You don't need to manage the collateral type. You don't need to do any of this stuff, right? Of course, you could say like one thing that might, what a trade-off might be could be liquidity. We'll have to see, right? Because of course, if you split everything into individual pools, you need depositors in all of the pools, so you cannot kind of like draw for like the common stablecoin deposit pool there. But of course, also it greatly comes with other kind of like positive trade-offs, such as like you can borrow against any asset, which is really cool, too. So yeah, like there's like a lot of these like experiments also going on, right? And I think if we're just going back to like what's interesting with Maker is that it's the first time where like a really big DAO organization is doing something completely innovative and new in regards to governance. A lot of these smaller ones we of course also follow. We're also going to be working with Ashna as soon as they're ready for this, right? Spark, if there's an opportunity, of course, we'll also be working there. But basically, like we also have a lot of these like smaller ones, which is where we see typically a lot of the experimentation, right? So yeah, like a lot of things happening across the board, and like yeah, like it's really like interesting times that we are like at the point now where some stuff has been tried, some stuff has failed, some people are traumatized for having participated in those things. So everyone is like just pushing like different ideas around, right? And we'll see what ends up working in the end. But yeah, we're definitely not anywhere close to having found the perfect model yet.
Yeah, totally. I think it's a good segue into the next area I wanted to touch on, which is how our position in the space relates to this podcast, right? Like we're involved with all these all these different protocols and communities. So I kind of wanted to touch on like what we're trying to accomplish here, and some of our governance goals as well.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that like the one of the main things is, we are kind of like sitting now in a situation where this is, one of I think like very unique times in like modern history, where we actually have a way of trying to influence the way that we organize ourselves in relation to companies, right? There's been a couple of other milestones like this, in regards to like corporate governance and some like political governance movements that happened in the last couple of 100 years. But like now we actually have like a technology which enables us to try to create like new organizational structures, and this is what we want to be participating in, right? So it's really about like like helping these protocols, which is crazy, right? We have like multi-billion-dollar protocols where like right now the participation and the kind of like the people who is contributing to these on a governance level are still like very immature, I would say, right? Like we really saw that like we didn't like how most of like the delegate space was like working, right? We believed there was a need for higher standards and more professionalism to this, and we really wanted to kind of like push the boundaries of like what delegates should be and what they could be, right? um so yeah, like I mean, our goal with participating in this space as like a contributor, right, is to help us actually achieve the goals that we want, right? And advance kind of like the whole like Web3 space, but of course especially now because DeFi is a little bit further ahead on the governance side, DeFi currently to really achieve what the promise is, right? And for this, you really need strong governance participants, and we want to be one of them, and we want to help them push them forward. We want to give our experience and learnings, and we want to we're already building products to kind of like help also like further improve the ability to navigate this like very complex thing of taking pieces of your organization and decentralizing them and opening them up to a broader community for them to participate in. So I think that is kind of like our like main things. I don't know. Do you want to add something here, Juan? I think you probably have some comments on how you want this to be communicated to all the people we are going to be onboarding into Web3 governance.
I think first off, one of the important thing to call out, and I know we're very humble as a team, but when I joined the team, I was like, okay, so this is the governance landscape. These are the delegates. These are the teams working in it, and StableLabs kind of stood out. And we also get this feedback, right, that like they appreciate how we kind of go about doing things in the space, and that's something I just wanted to call out. And I think the podcast is an extension of that, right? It's like we want to continue to provide value. I think we're a delegate team that we try to approach governance in a very responsible and a very collaborative way. And I think this podcast is that, right? It's a collaborative exploration of decentralized decision making in organizations, and conversations with a lot of our friends and a lot of our colleagues in the space, right? We have a lot of, right, when we're discussing creating this podcast, we're like, we have a lot of people in our network that have a lot of great knowledge, and so we should create a platform. Like, why not? We should create a platform to have these discussions, and there's a lot of people that are more than happy to kind of come on and talk about their experiences. But one thing I do want to call out, right, and maybe you have some additional thoughts about this, is people think, and I kind of touched on it earlier, people think governance is boring, right? We're not talking about trading here. We're not talking about some of this other cool stuff as it relates to Web3, right? We're talking about governance.
Yeah, but we have this like internal joke that like after we started working with governance, we don't need Netflix anymore, because I mean, now of course we work with over 20 DAOs, right? But like every single week there is some drama happening somewhere that we need to tend to. So yeah, this is also something that I think like it could be like cool also to try to bring some of these things a little bit more into the public eye, right? Because I think the stories don't always get told.
100%. So I think it's a good place to wrap. I wanted to kind of touch on what can people expect from the podcast? Like, how do you see it evolving? I know we've already touched on the types of guests and the types of conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really important for me and for us that we try to also like focus a bit on the individual, right? So like I feel like a lot of things in this space can become quite like unpersonal, and we kind of like try to detach the people from the work or from the technology, right? But I think like in a topic like governance, even though we try to say that we are these like autonomous organizations, and it's just addresses, in the space and on the blockchain that is like voting on certain things and topics like this just doesn't really fly entirely true, right? It is a lot about like individuals, like their experiences, and I see governance also as closer to politics, right? So like nation state politics compared to corporate governance. And there, again, if you look at politics, it's also kind of like with individuals in the front seat, right? So yeah, I think we want to have like a human approach also to the way that we think about these problems. Yeah. What about you? Like what is like the special thing you want to add here?
Yeah, totally. I mean, you mentioned this before to me before, that you really enjoy podcasts that speak on a human level. And I think there's more now. There's more now, more recently, podcasts that are kind of speaking to the individual about their experience. But they're not really related to governance, right? I think that's a big thing, that
Yeah.
there's definitely this gap. There's not a lot of conversations, right? And I do want to call out other podcasts that are kind of related to governance. We're all here to kind of improve. Like, we're so small at the space, and governance as in general is so small and still growing and nascent, that I do want to call out some of these other podcasts that are out there, and definitely, it's a collaborative thing here. And
I
so
mean, you
I'm
could also
happy.
say that. Yeah, you could also say that like making podcasts is not our main business vertical. So I think like we're just happy that there's other people also share the same mission as us, right? But.
Yeah, totally. This is a community first podcast. And so we would love to hear from you, the listener. Um, and yeah, this was great. This was very fun, Gustav. These are conversations that need to happen more often in a public setting. Sometimes they happen in Twitter Spaces, sometimes they happen inside of Discord calls, but now we try to get them, straight to you on Spotify, Apple Music, all that good stuff, and of course YouTube, right? This is being recorded video.
Yep. All right, awesome. Yeah, I hope that you guys will be tuning in, and we'll be announcing the first guests very soon.
Stay tuned, guys. Thank you so much, Gustav. We'll see you on the next episode of StablePod.